There's not many victims that you'll find that will celebrate that night of execution.
Life and death decisions.
To stand up for death row people that have done such horrendous crimes, I promise you none of those victims died without pain.
Justice or revenge.
What's the benefit of that for anyone? Revenge heals no one.
Biblically, there's a difference between innocent life and a guilty party.
It's hard to imagine on the lips of Jesus any kind of statement in favor of the death penalty.
The death debate.
I don't have any desire to work in any professional capacity on anything that has to do with the death penalty ever again.
Oklahoma is preparing for a new year, a new administration, and a new way to carry out executions. Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Mike Brooks. This is a Fox 25 special report. Oklahoma, once the home of one of the busiest death chambers in the country, has not executed anyone in nearly 4 years. And tonight, Fox 25's Phil Cross has the interviews you have never seen before, and he takes us inside the political, emotional, and religious battles in the death debate only on Fox.
Since 1915, Oklahoma has executed 195 people, but the state's current self-imposed moratorium began in 2015 when Oklahoma was in the national spotlight following a botched execution and a case that called into question everything we're supposed to believe about the justice system.
We have spent more time on this death penalty case than any other that I can remember. I actually got a copy of that from the media, from you, Phil. Governor Fallin has no reason to second guess, again, either the jurors or the courts, and so the execution will go forward.
In the fall of 2015, Alex Wentz, for better or worse, became the face the world saw supporting Richard Glossop's execution and Oklahoma's death penalty.
I really liked my job. I liked working for Governor Fallin, and I think we did a lot of good things in that office. This is a part of my job that I didn't like, and that it was hard to not take home with me to a certain extent.
Wentz had worked for Mary Fallin for years prior to her gubernatorial election and had spoken for her on a number of controversial issues in the past. But this was different.
My role in the governor's office was not necessarily to advocate for the death penalty. It was to explain what was happening in our office and to explain the governor's position. I was frustrated, and I think a lot of people in the governor's office were frustrated because I thought that outside forces, like Susan Sarandon, for instance,
the governor of Oklahoma is just a horrible person,
had come into the state and were essentially spinning a narrative which we did not agree with.
Award-winning actress Susan Sarandon, who became one of the most vocal supporters of Richard Glossop, would later apologize for calling Governor Fallin a horrible person. But Glossop's case and the questions about the accuracy of his conviction became an international powder keg, from celebrities to social media to even Pope Francis reaching out to stop the execution.
Our office quickly became a political pressure cooker.
But it wasn't just those opposed to the death sentence. The office also heard impassioned pleas of those on the other side of the death penalty debate.
There were people who were part of this process who viewed a successful execution as closure and justice for the Van Treese family.
Ultimately, it wasn't any of the pro or con arguments that led to the governor issuing a stay of execution. It was the 11th hour revelation the prison had received the wrong drug needed to end Glossop's life. Our first look at the pressure inside the governor's office on that day came in the 106-page grand jury report that detailed the failures of the state to carry out executions, complete with the now infamous call from the governor's then general counsel, Steve Mullins, telling the attorney general's office to just Google it, as he argued Glossop's executions should continue using an unapproved drug, knowing that it had worked before when the state apparently unknowingly experimented with killing, using potassium acetate instead of potassium chloride on the condemned Charles Warner earlier in 2015.
Everyone wanted to get it right, and was frustrated when, quite frankly, the state didn't get it right.
And it all added to Wentz's own internal conflict.
I think the best way to explain it is, on the one hand, I want justice and accountability. On another hand, I am, both as a person of faith and as a conservative, skeptical about giving government or other human beings ultimate power over other human beings.
Also troubling to wince, the unintended consequences on the rest of the people who find themselves, willingly or not, in the middle of the death penalty.
You're asking me about my role as a spokesperson. All I did was talk about it. Someone in the Department of Corrections' job is to inject people with poison and kill them. That takes a toll.
A new governor and a new staff will soon take over, but the problems of what to do with the death penalty remain.
The death penalty is something that sucks all the oxygen out of the room. It's defending the death penalty, or for that matter, attacking the death penalty, is something that takes a lot of moral and political capital and energy, and you may find that you don't have any left to do anything else that is truly constructive when you are done. So that is why I've become a skeptic of the death penalty.
But what about the victims? Where is the balance between justice and revenge? And can you have one without the other? Or does it even matter if you do both?
Why do they get to pick their last meal and get whatever they want? No, you should get a cruddy meal. You know, my son didn't get to pick his last meal.
Coming up on this Fox 25 special report, the victims of violence and the divide between those left behind over what to do with murderers. What is the proper punishment for killing someone? It's a question our society and our courts have debated for centuries, and your perspective on that question often depends on whether you attend a funeral before you attend a trial.
According to the coroner, the first blow was to her head and caused a hemorrhage. She screamed, and the second blow was to her throat, crushed her larynx.
When you kidnap someone and hold them and torture them for 24 hours, so you had that 24 hours to change your mind, but you didn't. You still continued to torture that poor kid.
These are the stories of the victims of some of Oklahoma's worst crimes and the families who survived them. Ken Bush helped found the Oklahoma Homicide Survivor Support Group after his daughter Kathy was beaten, raped, drowned, and stabbed.
Any victim that you talk to that's been in the grieving process for long, initially we go through that part that says, I want vengeance. I want them dead now, and I'll do it.
Bush was one of the first victim family members in Oklahoma who got to witness the murderer's execution.
You know, you think as you're building up to that, wow, it's going to give me some closure. Everything stops here.
Witnesses reported Floyd Allen Medlock said, "You all take it easy," to his family just before his lethal injection began.
For 11 years, I had someone to focus my hate at. He was alive and breathing, sitting in a cell, and that's who I could hate. And when he was dead, I didn't have anyone else to hate.
Bush still supports the death penalty, but says it should be used carefully and constitutionally.
I said then, this was not a night of celebration. This was a night of justice. And at that time, I knew. I knew that there was another family, his family, that knew my pain.
Taylor Heinzelman's mother, LaDonna, lives knowing the man who ordered the kidnapping, torture, and murder of her son walks free.
That was because the DA let them plea down to, they were both charged with first-degree murder, and they allowed them to plead to, one to accessory to kidnapping and the other accessory to first-degree murder. And I don't think people realize those two crimes are not considered violent in this state.
Only the person who pulled the trigger is in prison. He's serving life. LaDonna says she was promised it was a death penalty case. She's become an ardent supporter of capital punishment.
There's always that group of people that say, oh, you need to forgive them for what they've done to you. You're never going to have peace. I have plenty of peace in my life. And God's son was murdered too, and he knows how we feel and what we're going through. And if he can forgive the murderers, if they truly are repentful, he'll forgive us. And I'm not worried about that. I know I got God on my side.
When the death penalty is discussed in Oklahoma, inevitably, regardless of how supportive or unsupportive the debaters are, there is one case above all others that comes up. What about Timothy McVeigh?
I had a period of time after Julie's death, almost a year, that I supported the death penalty because I was so full of that revenge. I had to get my revenge.
Bud Welch lost his only daughter, Julie, on April 19, 1995. She worked inside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building and had just walked into the lobby to greet a client when the truck bomb McVeigh left outside the building exploded.
And I remember going down to the bomb site about 10 months after her death, and every muscle in my body ached, and it was caused from alcohol poisoning. And I went to asking myself, what did I need to do to move forward?
Bud would end up embracing a cause his daughter had championed while she was still alive: abolition of the death penalty.
And I recognized that the day that we would take Tim McVeigh from his cage to kill him was not part of my healing process.
While Bud, Ken, and LaDonna may disagree on the specifics or even the need for the death penalty, they do agree it isn't the so often cited word closure.
Closure is a media word. It's a way for a news person to attach something to it when they don't have anything else to attach. They call it closure.
Closure is something you do to the door. You close the door, you close a drawer. There's not closure in things like this. And just because your loved one's dead, you don't stop loving them, you never stop missing them.
What we all find out is the day that your loved one was murdered, you died with him. And you have to learn who you are all over again. I became someone else when my daughter died. That person that I was when she was alive died with her.
So if closure is a myth, then what is the death penalty?
If I had to argue why we need the death penalty, because we need justice. And that's what it has to remain, is justice.
An execution is not about correcting anything. An execution is basically revenge.
Oklahoma's last method of execution ended up being fought all the way to the Supreme Court. But in a state that is steeped in religion, the debate about capital punishment often appeals to a higher power.
When someone has a heart that's willing just to commit cold-blooded, premeditated murder, then the scriptural response to it is that person needs to pay with his own life.
Coming up on this Fox 25 special report, what is the good Christian response to the death penalty?
Yes, I'm a Christian, and I know that God forgives all. But the Bible also clearly talks about what happens to murderers.
According to the Pew Research Center, nearly 80% of Oklahomans identify as Christian, and nearly 90% believe in God. But is God divided on death? Each execution, we see religious groups speak out in protest. But on the flip side, when many people are asked why they support capital punishment, you often hear an eye for an eye answer.
In a state shaped by politics that often mirror religious teachings, you find politicians eager to share their self-described pro-life positions. In a political sense, pro-life applies to opposition to abortion. In a spiritual sense, well, here's Oklahoma City Archbishop Paul Coakley.
The church has always maintained the sanctity of life. Thou shalt not kill. We're created in the image and likeness of God, and life is precious.
The Catholic Church's position on how far to take thou shalt not kill has evolved over the years.
So we believe in the sanctity of life. We believe that the state does have an obligation to protect itself, to protect its citizens.
The position allows for the justness of wars and the punishment of prisoners. But in recent years, Catholic teachings have shifted away from supporting capital punishment.
Pope Francis has taken that a step further, in which he says that he can see really no situation in which the use of the death penalty is morally necessary or justifiable.
Archbishop Coakley says life should be protected from conception to its natural end.
It's sometimes harder for people to grasp the fact that even though though a person has committed a grievous, heinous crime, that they don't forfeit their human dignity, their God-given human dignity.
But that is not the end of the debate. Nationally, the Southern Baptist Convention has made it clear Christians should support the death penalty.
Quite frankly, I happen to be a Baptist, but I couldn't care less whether the Baptist church supports something or not, if it's clearly delineated in Scripture. And that's really what our standard is to be. What does the Bible say?
Pastor Paul Blair says from the beginnings of the biblical setup of civil government, God ordained the death penalty.
Obviously, this is a serious issue. Life is critical, and that's why I'm an advocate for ending abortion, because I think that's the senseless slaughter of innocent life, and no life should be taken lightly.
Blair says the Old Testament teachings call for 2 or 3 witnesses before the death sentence is handed down.
But if a person is a murderer in their heart, then the consequences of that is they should forfeit their own life. And it should be done with absolute justice.
But that's the Old Testament. What about the Gospels, which include a story of Jesus being asked to carry out an execution? Scriptures record Jesus saying the person without sin could cast the first stone.
Recognize that Jesus also wrote the Old Testament. There's one author of the Bible, and the Old Testament and the New Testament complete and complement each other. The woman taken in adultery was a unique situation, and quite frankly, it dealt more with hypocrisy of those that were making the accusation.
It's hard to imagine on the lips of Jesus any kind of statement in favor of the death penalty.
Catholics argue the death penalty is simply unnecessary in today's day and age. Life in prison fulfills the purpose of scriptural sentencing requirements. Plus, it allows for good to come from even the worst crime.
Blessed are the merciful, our Lord said. We can't ration God's mercy. We can't put limits on God's mercy. So I would say that nobody is beyond the mercy of God. No sin, no crime is beyond redemption.
While the justifications differ, both of these men of God agree between the seemingly arbitrary application that often unevenly impacts the poor and minorities, there are problems with how the death penalty is used.
The way it's carried out in this day and age, I don't know that it's effective. Because it's scriptural, I'm an advocate for it if it was carried out properly.
It seems that perhaps there's a growing desire in our state to see reforms in these areas. I truly hope so. I think the state of Oklahoma and the people of Oklahoma deserve better.
So where do we stand now? Oklahoma is on track to be the first state to use nitrogen gas as its primary means of execution. Coming up, we're separating fact from fiction in the death penalty debate. With lethal injection drugs becoming more difficult to get, the state announced earlier this year they are moving on to develop procedures to use nitrogen or other inert gas to carry out executions. One of the researchers on the project said Oklahoma should invest in a high-altitude training simulator to carry out these executions. Why? Because we know what that experience is like, which would make it easier to defend in court. We went to an Oklahoma surgeon and certified Air Force flight surgeon who not only knows medically what oxygen depletion does, but has experienced it himself. Now, one note, Dr. Joshua Carey is providing his medical and personal knowledge and is in no way endorsing or opposing capital punishment.
They put you in an altitude chamber and they pump the atmosphere out so that it's the pressures of the gases in our atmosphere are much, much lower. After a while that you're in there, you feel lightheaded. That's usually the first thing. After that, you get a little giddy. And then your judgment starts getting impaired. Your vision changes, but your color vision goes away fairly quickly. Specifically, this is called hypoxic hypoxia, meaning there is no oxygen, and that's why your oxygen levels are getting low. Eventually, my judgment was impaired, and I didn't want to put my mask back on because I was feeling too good. You don't have that sensation of burning, of your lungs needing to tear up. You've got to take a breath because it's the carbon dioxide that drives that. It's the carbon dioxide that makes you feel uncomfortable, that provokes all the anxiety. The oxygen and the lack thereof doesn't. Humans really are not geared to sense hypoxia. It takes only a handful of breaths at most before somebody goes completely unconscious. And they are completely unaware, sometimes even after only 3 breaths. And Once that happens and they're getting that little oxygen, then you can have things like heart arrhythmias and seizures as the brain is deprived of oxygen.
Dr. Carey says if nitrogen leaks out of the system to the bystanders or witnesses, it won't be a concern because we breathe in nitrogen mixed with oxygen with every breath. And as long as there is some ventilation there, no one witnessing an execution should feel any effects.
If you ever got called for jury duty and you were asked, would you vote for the death penalty?
I don't know. Is my honest answer to that question.
Alex Wentz left the governor's office shortly after all the attention over the Glossop case faded. He says the stress and issues surrounding the death penalty played no role in that decision, but 3 other people connected to Oklahoma's botched executions did resign in the aftermath. Governor-elect Kevin Stitt has said he supports the death penalty for the worst of the worst. But there are still no plans on how the state will implement the new nitrogen gas procedures. And right now, there are 47 men and women awaiting their fate on Oklahoma's death row, while more than 47 families wait for their promised justice. Phil Cross, Fox 25 News.